Hello and welcome back again to the next episode of Vocation. My name is Matty, and once again I'm joined by the great Michael Tsarion. We're going to be building upon what we have previously discussed regarding consciousness and psychology, and there's one concept that we haven't delved deeply into yet, which is about freedom. And so we're going to be discussing one of Michael's articles called The Freedom of Man. It's available on the Shelling Zone, and we'll leave a link to it down below. But I'll start off by just reading a little bit off this first, and then I'll pass it over to you, Michael, and we'll just take it from there. Go. So this is your article here on Shelling Zone, titled The Freedom of Man. It starts with a quote from Hegel. "The history of the world is nothing but the development of the idea of freedom." The history of the world is nothing but the development of the idea of freedom. If one does not want to worship God, one is free to worship freedom. And why not? Freedom is the essence of essences and deserves veneration. Freedom lies behind our choice of gods and commitment to worship the one we like best. Freedom lies behind our worldly devotions. The people we love are loved because love is itself an expression, an emanation of freedom. Without freedom, neither God nor man can save us. And so, I'll pass it back to you, Michael. What do you think about Hegel's quote here about the history of the world is nothing but the development of the idea of freedom?
Well, of course, thank you very much. It's great to be back with you. Yeah, I put that at the top because, of course, Hegel was obsessed with history and freedom. All the idealists were. And it took, but by Hegel's time, suddenly a new feature. You've heard of the history of philosophy. It doesn't need any explanation, right? The history of philosophy, the history of sages of the past, going back to Plato. What did they think? You think of books, you think of scholars. But wait a minute, there's a thing called the philosophy of history. This completely changes things, right? It's not so simple. And you had echoes of it with an earlier philosopher in Italy called Vico, but it was a gloss. It never consolidated until Hegel, who was the supreme, obsessor of this fact. So it's not just the history of philosophy, which of course somebody could study at school or college. That's interesting and all of that. It is now this more new, completely new branch of philosophy, the philosophy of history. Most later thinkers after his time were going to reject this concept. And his enemies began with Schopenhauer, who thought it was preposterous. He thought everything about Hegel was preposterous and that this was no different. Philosophy is a subject and history is a subject. You can't mess with that, You can't make one into the other. If history is a philosophy, then it ceases to be history. History is called history because that's the subject title, history, not philosophy. So, he made a mockery of this concept. But, for all the mudslinging, Hegel would just have laughed. He was a very genteel person. He didn't get upset. He even knew Schopenhauer. He thought all of these young upstarts were a bit foolish, He didn't get sidetracked at all because he would have said, look at the very garments that you're wearing, the very stitches that are involved in it, right? You and I have talked about on the last program the history of language with its metaphors. Symbolism. There is not a thing in our world that is not actually based in history. You had to get the needle and you had to get the thread, and then that became the loom, right? And then that became a factory, and all of this. So everything has its history, and so does consciousness. So this is where he was coming from. But then by his time, also because of his colleague Schelling, this concept of freedom had become very central to this process of unfolding. History is just nothing but a process, you see, that's unfolding and still got a long way to go, according to those guys, right? Before there's this sort of, we would now call it self-actualization of a higher, fuller state of awareness and transparency. And when that day comes, it will be something very much to do with realizing just how much freedom matters. And even all the little microscopic stages along the way will also be due to freedom. So the end result of this great teleological process will actually be a great paean, a great salute to freedom. Freedom in the end, but freedom as it kicked us off in the beginning. Now, if this is confusing to people, remember our previous comment about how the idealists were fascinated with this move from unconsciousness to consciousness to self-consciousness. And the last one, self-consciousness, for them was the big deal. How did that happen? And so they alighted on the fact that it was this freedom aspect. When they unpacked what freedom was, this is a movement that matters. And the strange thing is, you don't really find it in nature. In man's archaic beginnings, amongst the amphibian, when we were amphibians, allegedly, right? When we were reptoids, when we were marsupials, or whatever it might be. Look, when the little animal, a little fox, gets a thorn in its foot, like Andromedon in the lion, right? Or gets a sty in its eye, you're stuck with it. It doesn't have the brains or the intelligence to go to the doctor or get some drops, right? Or have some surgery. It's just stuck with the condition that it's in. And so the early philosophers noticed that this is the difference between necessity, which are fixed laws of nature, and what they call a freedom. Because there was a strange thing that happened that is not acknowledged enough. Because first, let me tell you that all the philosophers, but particularly these idealists, were fixated on finding the first Grund in German, of philosophy. That means a first principle. And they believed that most other first principles had been founded in quicksand. That if you go push up against them, they're not really that robust. They might be intriguing, like Plato's forms and other transcendent teachings and stuff. But by the time you get to Immanuel Kant, things start looking pretty vague. There's lots of weak areas that if you push them, they kind of collapse. We want some first principles. And then later people after the idealists also complained that they don't feel that the idealists were successful in that. I'm thinking later in history, right? Romantics and Marxists, they thought that hadn't actually been achieved. And then it's up to each person, you see, to study the matter and decide for themselves. Did these idealists create a first principle? And the first major idealist was a man called Johann Fichte, and he put the self, what we call all caps self, as this first principle, and it's arising. And most of the others agreed. But freedom then became very important as well as one of these founding principles. Because they would make the case that it just wasn't there in the natural world. Those are the laws of necessity. Fixed. I'll just give that anecdote about animals. But the human being can get up and minister to himself. He can go to a doctor. He can buy some eye drops. He can take that thorn out of his own hand. And he can do all of these other things. He can choose. He has the choice to do something other than just remain in a relatively fixed position. For nature, we need that fixed position. We need the laws and the rules of the cosmos. We need orbits. We need gravity. We need light. We need the behavior of water. We need soil. And all of those things are just on this sort of blind, like we said, the unconscious realm. And they're in these fixed patterns. And that's why they can be measured by science. But the thing is that at a certain point, when the human being came into being, he has, as if somebody has just waved this magic wand, he finds himself a free being. But nobody gives an account of how that could be. Where did that element come from? Well, they suddenly find out that not only is that a mystery, it's actually an imponderable. It's one of these strange imponderables, and we could talk about plenty of others. But it's not even that valued. And then later in their work, as the article will show, it became obvious that this is the highfalutin metaphysics of it. But then there's the moral component as well. Man can choose to do evil. And when Schelling took up this part of it, the moral part, he used it as a proof of God. The first man to ever use evil as a proof of God, to say only a good God would permit his creations to do unlimited evil without stint. Only a loving God would give you that level of freedom. You are the unloving one. You are the immoral one if you go and abuse it. In fact, let's pause for a minute. Can you read the final paragraph or the final two paragraphs? Because this will impinge upon exactly what we're talking about right now. It's worth it looking at it.
Yep, no worries. So these are the final two paragraphs in your article. The evil man, as an abuser of the moral law, suffers as a result of his regressive tendency. As Kant pointed out, he who wins all the world but gains what he has immorally, he is not a happy person at the end of his life. He is certainly not free. On the contrary, he is inwardly ashamed at the way he attained his riches and success. And no god or man can make him whole again. The evil man can only hope to fill the world with immoral or amoral people such as himself, and in that way justify his malignant behavior. But even if he succeeds in his enterprise, he won't find happiness. As Kant and Schelling show, the moral law is always an extension of freedom. It serves as a limit, but one that emphasizes the opposite of limitation. Moral law is therefore rational and sane. One conforms to it not out of fear or oppressive duty, but from care for oneself and others. The limit imposed on my will by the moral law opens a space for others to express their will. As civilized people, we give each other room and do so freely. We do so because we venerate freedom for itself. That is the mark of an authentic Dasein or human being. Establishing the moral law creates the space whereby we express our true selves. In that space, we are able to create, discover, interact, and grow. By way of our freedom, we are able to commune with beings like ourselves and know ourselves in ways not available to us in the wild. By way of our experience of freedom, we learn to get out of other people's way and not hinder them as they journey towards self-realization. In return for our virtue in this regard, other people learn to step out of our way, that we might more effectively attain the self-knowledge that can only be actualized by free beings in the world they learn to relate with purely and justly. And should we fail now and again, we have, as Schelling emphasized, our own history, personally and collectively, to remind us in no uncertain terms what not to do. And then just to end off, there's a final quote by Schelling here. History as a whole is a progressive, gradually self-disclosing revelation of the absolute.
Mm-hmm. Yes. He's talking about that over time, something's being built out. We're experiencing it. So there's something about freedom that isn't first grasped. There's things about, in other words, there's part that's grasped in the inception, but there's things that need to be lived and unfolded down through time. So he agrees with Hegel there. They both were in agreement about that. But what are the previous two paragraphs really about? There where freedom now becomes important in this moral law, in which what you're doing is you're freely not just doing good, because that's again a relative concept. No, you are allowing other people, right? You are creating a moral law so that one does not violate the space of another person. Each person has a circle around them, imagine, and you're keeping that tight to yourself, leaving room for everybody else. And when you do it to others, they are then doing it to you, and that's what creates a society. And this is then the space that we give each other, so that each person has the freedom to self-realize. Now, none of this is worked out. There's no law written, there's no book, there's no manual. You see, there's no great tome. But this is the implicit freedom that they were trying to address and trying to let us focus on. Now, of course, the evil man or the tyrant or the dictator, the narcissist, the psychopath, he's operating on a completely different level. He seeks to violate everybody else's space. He imposes his own will on everybody else. He just sees them as objects that they can be moved around. The only one in the world that matters or is really truly human is himself. So naturally, he's an immoral being. And he won't be happy at the end because everything that he gets is done in this immoral way. And there will be his conscience. He can't look back at the whole of his life like some mafia boss with trunks full of, silver and gold, but he can't take it with him. And also he's going to be, obviously, in a very, very dire straits towards the end of his life, thinking, you violated freedom. He may frame it by saying, oh, I think I'm going to go to hell. I think I broke God's laws or commandments. No, the main commandment you broke, mate, is the law of freedom that gave you the right to get what you wanted. You exercised freedom. Wait a minute. I exercised freedom? That's right. What being allowed you? See, Schelling's trying to get a thought here. What being would be allowing you to do all the evil in the world, regardless of its expense? Only a good God would allow his creature that much freedom. So this is how he framed it. But going back to the more original point, in the natural world, in archaic thinking, in archaic circumstances, there's not that level of freedom at all. So again, back to the point, how did freedom itself then suddenly appear in the human world? And they wanted to make this the first principle, and they did. Because it's just not there in the archaic sense. When you go back to the amphibian, or any other primitive life form, even amongst apes and things like that, the hominids, that's just not there. It couldn't be there. Now, then they started to unpack this, and in the article I explain what this was all about, how they did. And they believed that, wait a minute, you need this unfree world as a sort of a objective, imagine like a theater or a backdrop, so that in relief of it, the free being stands out in relief in his garments of freedom. If nature was free itself, then there'd be nothing unique to see in man. He'd just blend right into the background. And if man was also a being that was what they call was necessary, and of course there is a part of us that is with a human body, then we would blend back into the background and we just fuse as one. Now they call that nothingness. That fusion is a breakdown in the primal dualism. The dualism is required because one is bouncing off the other, in the subject-object way. And so they preferred to say it that man's subjectivity, his sense of self, his sense of I, is entirely based in the existence of something of a background, which we know as nature, that doesn't possess an attribute or two that man does, so that when man shows up on the scene, his attributes show up. And they added that this is not accident. It's planned that way by a higher supernal will, i.e. spirit. So that means that the apparently fixed laws of nature are actually ordained by a willful God, a willful spirit, and therefore partake in freedom. This is what Schelling's point was. So nature, although to our dimension of thought looks fixed, it was organized that way because how could a fixed law create freedom? It has to be the opposite way. Only an unfixed, free law could make fixed patterns, not the other way around. And it's the same in our own thought. We, being free beings, know full well that sometimes the decisions we make do lead to unchangeable circumstances. You experience this in your own life. Things that you did with, a sense of freedom and a sense of choice often lead to things that become more permanent and stuck and unchanging. That's right. But the fact remains, though, that your free will initiated that thing that became necessary or fixed. The fixed law could never possibly, ever create freedom, and doesn't. So this means then that we are miracles. We couldn't be caused by nature, because nature moves along fixed lines and will do so for millennia. Think of the phenomena of time. Time is eternal. But anything in time is obviously going to perish. You see, so there are these strange paradoxes, these strange laws. But it's like a great artist on a canvas. I won't be able to see the black dot if the canvas is also black. And if it's a white dot and the canvas is white, I don't see the dot. I need the contrast. So this primal dualism then became also one of the great central ontological facts of idealism, a primal disharmony. I call it contrarium. Somebody could call it oppositorium for short. It's just this primal dialectical monism is how it's really referred to in philosophy, where one thing is expressing itself in two different ways, and there's no getting around it. And those would be, Thanatos and Eros, centrifugal, centripetal, whatever way, progressive, retractive, all different ways that you can think of it. expansive and contractive, things like that. Life and death, even, right? Life and death instincts. Now, out of this duad, then is a major mechanics of this I. So, how do you even get to this first splitting? Is even more interesting. There's a central unitary I that gets created. And you and I have spoke about this before, but not in any depth. We kept it very superficial. But we did mention that consciousness is bizarre because it knows how to split into subject and object within itself. No materialist can ever answer that. They pretend there's something, other conversation going on as soon as you even look like you're going to raise that question. How is this inner polarity possible? How does a thing that should be a unitary thing have this dimension? How can it be observer and observed at the same time? Well, nobody can explain it. It's an imponderable. But the idealists wanted to look deeper into that. And people like Fichte said, well, here's the weird thing about that. When the I splits into the real I, the transcendent I, let's say, right? Or for now, we'll just use the word empirical I, the empirical I that you know. But then that I has an idea of itself. It's like it stepped outside itself and looking back at itself. So this empirical I is able to divide. But as soon as the idea of the I becomes apparent to the I, that idea, that object, the objective part of us, needs a background on which to sit. It can't just sit in blackness. That doesn't work. Remember, I said everything needs a relief. Yeah. And the background of the objective I is nature. So the objective I during the split and nature are coterminous, coeval. They arose at exactly the same time. They have no independent existence. So the great idealists threw out the idea of a hard divide between, although we're talking about a split, nature looms into being. Imagine it's like a hologram or a light source. The very moment that the objective I takes birth, it's like dawn, right? A light appears on the horizon, and suddenly you have this background of nature in which is then the cloak. You see, the theater upon which the objective I that we are project will forever remain. So you can't have the splitting without nature coming into existence. And then by the time Schelling got his mind around this, he started to prioritize, the natural. He wanted to look deeper into the natural order, and he did so. Fichte was a little bit reticent. He put the focus mostly on the I and its mechanisms. He certainly acknowledged that nature was there, but it kind of wasn't as deeply valued, perhaps, in Fichte, one says. This is all, open to argument, though. But Schelling was what's called a nature philosopher, a mystical naturalist who just went to town with it. Hegel would change it later. Hegel would come along and go, I get it. I get what you guys have done. Fichte, yeah, he was my teacher. Schelling, you're my colleague and teacher. But where nature stands, I'm going to put another element, which is the process of history. For me, is even a little bit more important. The unfolding of history. Schelling had talked about that, but Hegel is the one who wanted to make the movement of history foremost as one of these first principles. For Schelling, it is nature. For Fichte, it was the I. But they're all connected. And don't bother with scholars who try to overstate their differences. They're all linked. And there's a whole bevy of other little philosophers in there. The great poet Holderlin was a friend of theirs and a roommate. He was Germany's greatest poet, and he was a nature poet. And he was their colleague. They all lived together, right? So, and went to school together. So there's a lot of other genius people in there in that circle. They looked up at Goethe. They looked up at Schiller. You see, Rheingold was another one. There's plenty of other names one could mention, actually. So this was a school, and they were all commenting on the same thing. But the idea is that then this duad, if there's anything more to say about it, the duad exists not only in the empirical I, because how did that get to divide? Some of them thought It's because the eye has that attribute of splitting because God had it first. And God has extended his own nature to the human eye, right, to the self. Therefore, the eye found it like splitting chromosomes. It found itself able to polarize this bifurcation that took place. But that capacity was written in it because even on a deeper ground, God's own consciousness, God's own spirit had this, disharmony within it, this yin yang, this polarity. And therefore it's primordial. And they just hunkered down on that. These guys we're talking about hunkered down on that the nature of God cannot be understood without this primal dualism. Now, this primal dualism may be very poorly expressed, as it is mostly in Christianity, between God and the devil. But once you understand that that's a cartoon, it still has an element of truth. It's just primitive, right? It was just a cartoon, the proles, the dumb show version of a much, much deeper metaphysical truth. So they were physical, and they give this account of how nature itself comes into existence. And with this concept that we're talking about, it explained this old problem of why nature has evil within it. Why there's, evil amongst the animals, the rapacious animals killing the other animals and all of that used to put a lot of atheists off. Right? See, these ideas were able to account for this. And say, we know what you atheists always think. When you look around at the world and see all this, everything's red and blood, tooth and claw, that puts you off believing there is a metaphysical reality because from one perspective, it looks so awful. But don't be fooled. That because you have it counterpointing the beauty of nature, the mystery of nature as well. You get the good and the bad. You can't live without the sunlight. You see, you can't live without water. But just about when you're thinking of the nature as a wonderful, wonderful paradise, then you see, the carnage of lions, eating an elephant that takes 6 hours to die as it's being alive, things like that, right? And just the monstrosity of it. So we're caught, and we just gave up. We just give up. When this contrast, we just give up. We can't even form a concept. Sort of a blind atheism is about, the default for most people. But the Idas were able to talk about the fact that in this primal dualism, there is the good and the evil. There is the life force, and there is its opposite. You have Eros and you have Thanatos. You have the centrifugal and the centripetal. In other words, you have the expansive growth, reaching out towards the sunlight, the development, we would know that as creativity and love. And then you have the opposite pole where things want to retract and remain in the darkness and pull back into a state of oblivion or death. And that's it. And it explains it. That primal dualism has to be there. If everything was good, then human good wouldn't stand out in relief. If everything was bad, then the human traits again would not stand out in relief.
Mm-hmm. When we speak about this primal dualism, one of the ones that comes to mind was the work of Descartes, where he sort of spoke about there was this split between mind and matter. Whereas when I'm reading a bit about the idealists, I can take a quote, I think it's from Schelling. He wrote, "Nature is visible spirit, and spirit is visible nature." How do you reconcile the two of those? Where did Descartes go wrong, and what's the link between spirit and nature, really?
Well, of course, that would also impact the whole difference in the thinking of the Germanic world, the Germanic Empire, the Germanic mind, and the French and the British, by the way, as well. And the French and the British just defaulted back to this very mechanistic. It later on became very atheistic and technological, but it started off just as this kind of rebuttal of everything we've talked about. And that man is special, all right, and man may have free will, all right. But because nature doesn't appear to have it, like we already said, they didn't look for the connection between the two. They did not express anything that I've talked about. They just thought of the natural world as something lower, something relatively foul, and metaphysically lower than mind. You see? Yeah. And all that Descartes' terminology was to do was to set up his own mechanistic what they call the Cartesian theory. He had to work to do that. And so he wanted to prioritize thinking. He wanted to prioritize thinking, but when it's translated as I think, therefore I am, the famous cogito ergo sum, it's not 100% correct. Because if you actually read the text, he bases his thinking first on doubt. Right? The whole experiment in the book, him sitting in his armchair and going through this whole, what's called the meditation, the first meditation, is him doubting absolutely everything in the world that there can be to doubt, including his own existence. So it actually doesn't begin with thinking. It begins with radical doubt, radical skepticism. That's the real first step. So it's not I think, therefore I am. It's I doubt, therefore I am. And this is where then a problem arises. Because he discovered that if there's a doubter, then there must be a being there to doubt. So the doubt actually leads to a kind of certainty, which is that I know that because I can doubt that candle and those shadows on the wall and the firelight in front of me, and I can doubt reality, and can even doubt my own existence. However, that doubt doesn't leave me in a total black hole. There must be a doubter, and that establishes a self. And then that self is the thinker. But then what happened was that his problem there, of course, was the fact that he believed that this supernal mind, this thing that is now the thinker, was itself divided off in a hard way from the material world that didn't have that kind of thought. And he went to lengths then to sort of, explain how the two then work together. And he brought up this idea of a good God and things that, sort of pacified a lot of Christian minds. But of course he had to. People were being burned at the stake. He was under surveillance from the Jesuits in France. So most people know that the stuff he brought up about God was just to save his own life. There's a doubt as to whether he himself is a great scientist, and believe you me, he was one of the top mathematicians that ever lived. He practically created calculus and all of this kind of thing, right? So to get around, in fact, he moved to Sweden to become a tutor of the Queen Christina of Sweden, but he died there because it was so cold. He got sick. So these Christian anecdotes, can be taken with a pinch of salt. His thinking had to be reined in. You see, he couldn't possibly, like any of the thinkers on that day, they couldn't really speak as they wanted to. And there's other problems with this whole concept of the I think as well, But the doubt is the radical skepticism that can you make that a first principle of philosophy? Well, they did. The whole world did. But the question arises, hold on, that's not a particularly optimistic or practical way to go about it. It's only a practical way to maybe establish some sort of scientific paradigms. So there's a lot of things you can get into there.
Maybe even just to take a step back for a little minute, just to understand the importance of freedom and how that's coming into our discussion so far about psychology and about consciousness. I've heard you speak before about saying there's 2 or 3 big evolutions of thought that happened over time. One was this Copernican one where, the Earth is in the center of the solar system, and that we revolve around the sun and not the other way, basically. And then you spoke about Freud being one of these major things where, through the discovery of the unconscious, man wasn't in absolute control of his own decision-making. And the role of the unconscious had a huge effect in that as well. And so people can get trapped and go, oh, well, maybe we're just this machine of biological impulses that we have to sort of abide by because there's no other choice. However, what we spoke about in terms of the different structures of the psyche previously was that there's 2 different moral centers within man. One being the conscious and one being the superego. And I believe the freedom exists in your ability to choose which voice to follow. What are your thoughts on how freedom comes into this aspect of the discovery of Freud and his work as well?
Well, of course, by the way, there's also an article on my site called Descartes' Error that, can get into a little bit more about what we just spoke about. You can link that up if you want. But yeah, to get to this question, everything in psychology, especially of the Freudian model, was preceded by the philosophers. And you see, a lot of people that came after Immanuel Kant were answering Immanuel Kant. Because, and this includes the three idealists I mentioned, and the whole school of psychoanalysis, and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. Right? They were on the more atheistic side, but nevertheless, their thought was permeated with responses to what Immanuel Kant had created. And he created what they call a second Copernican revolution. But it was in philosophy. The original Copernican revolution refers to, astronomy, and that the sun is the center of the universe, the galaxy, and we move around it. So when Kant came along, some smart aleck readers thought, hey, this is like a second Copernican revolution. But what did it really mean? What is this Kantian, revolution? It's just that the change was from metaphysics to epistemology. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that deals in the knower. And funny enough, even though this knower or self had been on the stage of philosophy for a long time, think back to the Greeks, know thyself, right? It's inscribed at Delphi. Well, know thyself, then obviously they acknowledge the self. But even though that's the case, really, at the end of the day, the metaphysics didn't prioritize what we now in the modern age would know as selfhood that much. It was in the background. It was one of the actors on stage, so to speak, but it didn't have any lines. The focus of metaphysics was reality, was God, was nature. Then as we move down through the centuries, we get to history, like I just said, you see, with Hegel, and you get these other things being prioritized and slipping away. But when Immanuel Kant came on the scene, he is the one who decided that there had to be a big change and that the metaphysics had got us nowhere. Basically, this is what he was saying. We're going round and round. Science was making many, many brilliant new discoveries. Let's think of the age of Galileo, Isaac Newton, Kepler, people like that. He just saw it and he was a scientist, so he was on the side of science. But he had some sympathy with philosophy, and he thought, what are we going to do to upgrade philosophy? It's like, the impoverished brother here that's way behind. So this was what was on his mind. And so he then turned around and said, well, wait a minute. One thing that has been missing in philosophy is the epistemological aspect. Who is the knower? Who asks the questions, the metaphysical questions? Who is this being that just sits at the center of everything? I have an article we can link up to called The First Philosopher that goes into this. When man himself became his own focus, not things outside himself, but he himself. This was almost the first time ever in history that this had ever happened. And Kant was of the opinion that we know very little about ourselves, and that this had been the missing part. And it was a revolution. People were like, oh my God, blown away. And this then, right, within a very short time, within 100 years or less, this gave rise then to other schools like psychoanalysis. It gave rise to new art, and all sorts of different movements that would affect our day. And you simply could not have psychology as we know it, not of any kind, without this. Because where Kant turned things around, it was your Freuds and people around him that kicked open the door properly and said, we got to really, get into this. And I have a podcast that we did a few years back called Explaining Modern Art, where everything is detailed. And even a couple of the podcasts following that, we went into this Anatomy of Human Destructiveness 1, goes into this whole era and its implications. And of course, it was revolutionary, but very, very recent. Yeah. And out of it, not only comes psychoanalysis, but basically the whole postmodern world will come out of this. Doesn't mean that the men I'm saying are responsible for it, but even what we know as romanticism, progressivism, Marxism, pluralism, a lot of this is going to sort of take birth in not just in this, but certainly in this, and then the British and the French took that and welded it with the mechanistic Cartesianism, and that's how you get your kind of reductive materialism, which is really an obscenity because it's under the hands of some very, very shallow thinkers. I try to go to people with a much more robust type of thought, and Kant also believed in a hard dualism, just like Descartes did. So this is where the other people who came after them sort of faulted them. For why in your philosophy is I'm always finding this extremely rigid division between subject and object. So Schelling, everything we started talking about today, they were working it to try and show you that divide, that cleft, just isn't there, or not in any hard way. If I find, and we've talked about this before, that if the mind is able to split in the first place, then I find it difficult to speak about a pure objectivity, because it's the mind that's doing it. Mind is on both sides. So objectivity is somewhat of a myth. But we know that if on a fundamental level objectivity breaks down, then automatically the subject, as we know it as a construct, breaks down, and they collapse into each other. Yeah. And so this was then a very, very important thing. You need it on a sort of a more pragmatic level. Yes, okay, for, cognition's sake. But actually, it's more of a model. And so this gets to the heart of your question. When Freud and everybody came up, they said, well, we need models too for the new paradigm. It's all models. Kant's thing is a model, right? The noumenon and the subject-object is a fucking model. Hey, Mr. Fichte. You see? Hegel, and Fichte, your synthesis, your thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that's a model. We're coming down with models here. But remember, here's the other thing. We might get to talk about this later. The difference was that after Immanuel Kant came Charles Darwin. Don't forget that. And so he didn't have that. He was answering people like David Hume and, other philosophers of the 1600s that have very interesting things to say. But wait a minute, what is happening as we move towards the 19th century? We have Darwinism. So none of the things we're talking about can be relevant to our modern age. Now, the idealists also were they were aware in Germany, there was many of these Darwinists and proto-Darwinists and people who were studying natural history. And everything that the idealists were doing had to be relevant to their findings. See, these idealists worked in the great universities and colleges where down the hall are these natural Darwinist scientists coming up with their theories. So these idealists weren't working in some sort of isolation. Oh no, Hegel was very, very up on things that were going on. The guy there to look up was a guy called Haeckel. I think his first name was Ernst Haeckel. Yeah, can't remember right now. Haeckel, Haeckel or something. He was the great Darwin of Germany. There's a whole school of German Darwinists, and so they were creating their philosophies with full knowledge of the discoveries that were being made. But by the time you're getting to Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and Freud, this Darwinism thing has taken over. And you and I have talked about it before, and when we talked about man as beast. Yeah. So the idealists would never have accepted that because they're looking at all the things we talked about the magic and the miracle of freedom and this bifurcation of consciousness. That doesn't talk about no bestial origins, but the other side that was later on picked up by British and French materialists and then by America, this was now the paradigm. Man is certainly a beast. He's just ruled by his instincts. And so remember, freedom now takes a back door. Man is now man is a creature of nature. And as we've already said, that now brings back the fixed laws, which do rule your body. Let's admit that. It's only your consciousness that's free. But materialism, we're just going to park that. And we can bring up something else that's relevant to this. I don't know if you want to, if you have time.
Sure. Crack on.
See, and this will have a lot of impact on the origins of existentialism, by the way. So I think it is worth getting into, but it impacts what we're talking about this move into atheism and into positivism and technology. See, around about the period we're talking about, or maybe before, about 1600s, with John Locke, and the founders of the materialistic movement. There was a rage between the two sides at this time, the materialists and the over whether or not the mind comes into the world as a blank slate. The Latin is tabula rasa, white slate, blank slate, and through the senses starts to register stuff from the world. And that's how we get filled up. There's nothing in our consciousness, they say, that doesn't come from the world. You can check your own consciousness and prove that. That's what they said. And then the anti-materialists, they said, no, you come into the world already with what's called innate ideas or innate categories. Latin for that is a priori, before experience. And in fact, you couldn't have the sensual experience unless you had these categories. They allow you, see, to interface with the world. And then, as a secondary thing, you're able to process and organize the sensual experience. But as we move up to the 20th century, and you can date this, it's difficult to date exactly. Some people say, well, it's from Franz Brentano, it's from Edmund Husserl, it's from Martin Heidegger. But as you're moving into the 20th century, some thinkers started to notice something weird with this. And that is, for 400 years, although the mind has brilliantly asked the right questions about itself, I've just mentioned what those are, it doesn't have the answer. Nobody had ever noticed this. Why are we thrashing around in the dark? Why, in 400 years since that question was first asked, has there never been a definitive, categorical answer from the mind itself? You'd expect that the mind that can ask these questions about its own identity, whether I have innate categories of understanding, or I'm coming in as a blank slate, who else is going to answer it except me? And yet, there's no answer. So both sides were kind of flummoxed. All you can ever have when it comes to those questions is an opinion. And we don't put opinion as the first principles in philosophy. We don't put opinions anywhere in philosophy. They're for the common man, they're for the street. So you thought Kant had a problem with the previous metaphysics? Here's another one. Here is another one. By the time of Freud and these Darwinists I'm talking about, right, something radical has taken place again in philosophy that sort of rocks the boat majorly. Why is the mind unable to give us its own? It can ask the questions, that's brilliant, but it doesn't provide the answer. So what we would call the first phenomenologists came along. They're different. There's a new school. And they said, well, you know what the answer to this is? We now need to change the focus of philosophy from what we know to what we experience. We have to abandon, or, not abandon, but we've got to change things around. We still live to know things, but we can't be looking for first principles now that this has been established. But the one thing that can replace it is putting the focus on what we experience of a day in real hard phenomenological terms. And then it's not so much about knowing and analyzing, it's more about just describing. You see? There's a big shift here. It doesn't mean much to laymen, but it's a very, very big shift. In fact, everything that's happening today is based on it. And it swells out to impact everything we've just been talking about why idealism was parked, why Freud and everybody else, came up. And it also is the birth of existentialism, because the few phenomenologists who set this foundation, they sort of evolved, into existentialists. Martin Heidegger was a secretary to Edmund Husserl, who created phenomenology. Yeah, they worked together. He was a little protege, right? And later on, he went on to write Being and Time, which became the great tome of existentialists. So the existentialists are paying more attention to this, what I've just explained, not to the rationalists, not to the old metaphysics. Some of them have interesting things to say about those traditions, but really they're modernists and postmodernists, and they're looking at this question. The mind cannot answer. The mind does not provide an answer, and that's what we want. And when we radically accept that it cannot provide the answer, We then have to radically rethink the whole of philosophy, and that's what they did. And so they came up with phenomenology first, which shifts the focus from what you know, so to speak, into what you experienced. And then it's Heidegger who then massaged this out to make just change the world, just blow everyone away. And then everyone from that point on is just a footnote to Heidegger. They're all copycats. The French, the British, everybody else just took up what he was doing and sort of adapted it. And your Herbert Marcuse's and many on the left, Jacques Derrida, Foucault, they're on the left. They took his teachings and mangled it and turned it into progressivism as well. So, feminism comes out of it. Deep ecology movement comes out of it. The founder of deep ecology, Arne Naess, was a student of Heidegger. And so it just explodes now. You can't blame Heidegger for any of this, right? But it sparked a whole new way of looking at life. And the left got a huge infusion of adrenaline also from this, not to mention also from people like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, as well. It animated their theories as well.
When we speak about the phenomenology, it reminds me of Hegel's work where he wrote the phenomenology of spirit, or of Geist, as he calls it, which is somewhat similar to what we're talking about when we speak about the psyche. And so his way of understanding the movement of Geist, the movement of spirit over time, which is a reflection of the movement of nature over time, he did this by being able to study his own consciousness in a way. And he was able to see we had this thesis, antithesis, and then this sort of combination of it to bring it together. And then this has moved further forward of phenomenology into then you spoke about the start of psychology as well also. And it brought up earlier how freedom lies in one's ability to turn towards the conscience or to the superego. We spoke a little bit previously about how people can tell the difference between these two internal voices. And you'd mentioned before what you need to work on are these tools of discernment. What do you mean by the tools of discernment? How can people tell the difference between the voice of the superego and the voice of the conscience, which is maybe like the voice of nature in a way?
Great question. Almost impossible to answer, really, because you see, it comes with experience. And it's all going to be graded. The more a person conforms to the abnormal society, you would expect that they would be very discontented because of the shame. Because the shame only arises when you're doing something false to the self. Yeah. But I think that really all human beings, they're not really concerned with the conscience or shame at all. They're concerned with lowering guilt.
Anxiety.
Yeah. And big medicine, psychiatry, most of everybody around you, that's the almost prime focus. And any school that arose that looked like it might for a minute be trying to deal with the other side, like existential psychology, it didn't get any traction. It didn't get bankrolled. So it fell off the map. It doesn't even exist. You'll never hear about it. I'm one of the only people that even mention it in this entire movement, right? But what this boils down to is that man settles for the lowering of guilt in order to feel better. And there's a myriad ways of doing that. His joining the crowd as a hysteric is one of the big ways of lowering guilt, because you're getting all the cues and affectations from other hysterics like yourself. And you have a narrow cause. Hey, Trump, get him! So that narrowing puts a smile on your face. People it's very, very hard to understand this until you know your psychology. You actually feel a kind of elation and euphoria for being in the crowd, in the thugocracy, and from having these narrow, highly focused causes, so to speak. And they can be anything. Right now, we all know what they are now, but on another planet, they could be anything else. The causes are really insignificant when you're looking at this. Yeah. It's really secondary. But nevertheless, the fact is, when you get into the cause, you're narrowing your focus and you're only thinking about that. And when you're not thinking about that, right, all these other anxieties are parked. It's a kind of a dissociation. It's not repression. Repression is a very different, when you break it down. This is more dissociation. I'm just not thinking about it. Repression is something you do and you don't know you're doing it. You forget and forget that you forgot. That's repression. Dissociation is just saying, well, I'm not aware of it. Like I'm not aware of my shoelaces right now.
Mm,
Right? Or I'm not
yeah.
aware that, I'm hungry or something or thirsty. You just
Mm.
dissociate.
I think it's maybe related to this concept that we came up with last time, this interoception. The better you can gain an understanding of your bodily awareness and of your internal state, partially through the shadow work that we've discussed before, which is largely body work, then you can get a better understanding of these different voices within inside the psyche, of the superego and of the conscience. We spoke a bit about how, if you listen to the superego, it may lower your anxiety. However, you're pushing down your authentic self, which raises shame. One of the ways I think people can understand the difference of the two is if you're following the voice of the conscience, there's this great sense of meaning that comes from it, this will to meaning. Whereas if you follow the voice of the superego and aim to get rid of your anxiety and to lower your guilt, it's power that seems to motivate it more towards me. What are your thoughts on that a little bit?
Yes, 100% right. It's the difference between being and having.
Mm, mm, mm,
The monstrosities that join the crowd, that go towards the superego, are interested in getting and having. Right? The outsider is interested in being, and the two don't match. They really don't. And you're quite right. The whole essence is in body work, because when I said, how do we ignore the shame? We push it down. Right? So the schizoid has his way of doing that. The depressive has his way of doing that. The obsessive compulsive has his way of doing it. And the hysteric has their way of doing it. Each one is defined by his own coping mechanism, of suppressing the shame and maintaining either a very, very, very perfect or sort of slightly imperfect connectivity with his fellows. The depressive has tried it many times, doesn't quite get the approval, so he sits in a funk. But give him the 3 stripes, he's perfectly back to normal again. He's totally adjusted to the abnormal world. But if you're not looking closely, the depressive looks like an outsider for all of 5 minutes, and you can be fooled. Say you knew people like this, right? You can be fooled. Think, oh, they're really interesting people. They're kind of loners, and you can be fooled into thinking that they're genuine outsiders just because they're on a downer, just because they're a bit depressed because they didn't join the party. But later on, when times are rocking and rolling, and suddenly they found a thing to be joined, the depression is gone, and they're like, "Whoa, what happened to you?" Yeah. So the crowd is also full of depressives. Funny enough, you see. So for each one of these 4 types, you get this going on. But you're right. Each one of these has suppressed the shame into their own bodies, into the nerves, the fibers, the cells, into the, it becomes what's known as emotional plague, to use the Reichian terms, right? Or armoring is another term you can use. Now, the person who then realizes that they're sick in this biopsychic way, right? In the psychosomatic way, they go to get the therapy, hopefully, if they're very, very, very fortunate, and their body will speak, or their stiffness. You see, something that sends you to one of these therapists. The rigidity, the inability to sleep, the tightness, the spastication, something about you will be false, and you'll know it, and you'll know this is not right. Or you'll start to envy people who are somewhat more graceful, and you admire them, and you say, well, why are they like that and I'm not? And slowly, if you read a book, or two, or you see something about it, you might realize, and that's when the doors are open, and you'll realize where it's all coming from. And therefore, a Reichian therapy is going to say, yeah, your childhood situation is important because it set the foundations for all of this, but you're gaining shame now in this world right now. Otto Rank would agree. There was philosophers, there was psychologists who said, yeah, we do focus on the childhood, but we focus on your existence today. These dynamics, what you're doing and causing your self-pathology, are ongoing now. It's not to negate what Freud said or what others, young as, Melanie Klein. No. But the human being is a living entity right now. a person who had a very good upbringing and may have fantastic parents could be a complete nervous wreck today from the pressures today. So they became the humanists. They became the psychologists who said, yeah, childhood, fantastic. We'll look into that. But man is under pressure today, right? The boss at work, the routines that he gets into, his ambitions, his self-schema, his self-esteem, the failures that he may experience, the self-doubt, the losses. There's so much going on. And also this feeling of, shame. Should I follow the masses and the herd and do exactly, compulsively and obsessively exactly what they want? Clip it, pump it till it hurts, get it right. When I was young, I got all of that approval for doing that. So being clean, being on time, fixing my schedule, combing my hair properly. I got to have those pleats and pleated trousers. Everything has to be pressed and immaculate. Sure, I know for a fact I got lots of pats on the head back there in church and at school, and my younger brother who's a slob, and those guys in the playground at school who were slobby, nobody liked them. You see, I've got it. Yeah, look at my Rolex. Look at I have a new car every year, right? You see? So man conforms. And then comes to 35, he's lying on a psychiatrist's bench going, I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm manic. Right. So the shame is either taken over or has manifested not consciously, but in the body in an unconscious way. Breakdown in sexual health, breakdown in other forms of health. You see, will force you, hopefully, but then, of course, there's pitfalls there. But this thing we were talking about led this inability of the mind to answer a fundamental question. Overturned the world. And the phenomenologists said their way of dealing with it, existentialists, that's why the word existence, it became not what you know, but how you're living, that became important. And then others, from other schools like the progressives and the romantics and whatever, and even the anarchists and the Marxists all start biting off big chunks of this. You see, and it matters today. And they would say this has been a problem all the way from even before the period I've just talked about. They could go back to David Hume and say, hey, look up David Hume, arguments against causality. He said that the mind can't even discover whether a cause really makes an effect. And this is true. This haunted mathematics. Cause and effect is a myth. Cause and effect is just what's called a contingent reality, right? That it's based in repeated experiences that we take for certainty. But under that, which is nothing more than a bunch of assumptions, cause and effect is nothing more than just a contingent reality. There's nothing actually mathematically certain about it. So you can't have that as a certainty, not even in the sciences. And he's never been refuted. In fact, every time they've tried to refute it, they just make the case stronger. Then after him came Immanuel Kant, who basically went on in a different way to say the same thing about something different. This time it's reality and appearance, right? The noumenon and the phenomenon. Man's mind can ask the question, but cannot come up with a definitive answer between what is an appearance and what is reality. It's permanently incapable of answering that. Then we just came up with this one. There's the third one about Locke and the innate ideas. Then we came up with a fourth one. The mind cannot speak of itself. Remember last time we talked about metaphor? So we're coming down with these imponderables. Why are they imponderables? We trusted language, we trusted evolution, we trusted mind. Consciousness, evolution. Things are getting smarter, aren't we? Getting clever. Yet it goes on and on through time. But when it comes to some of these metaphysical truths, we're not able to understand it. So the metaphysician then says, because you keep on leaving the true metaphysics out. And I do too, because that's why I say you have to bring back a certain amount of idealism here. One of the things that stopped us answering these questions is because we parked very legitimate philosophical and psychological schools that approach a fucking answer. But because the Brits, the Fabian Marcusans, and the French deconstructionists held sway. And because we have an actual thing called Germanophobia loose in the world that most people have no idea what that is. You see, this all took place. And we're down here in the dump of your Baconian, Hobbesian paradigms with Auguste Comte in France, and all of this thievery as well. So how it relates to today is because the progressive also picks up on this. He's learned from his high priests about this thing we talked about, that the mind is incapable of X, right? And they say, you see, it's all about experience. I'm not a thinker anymore. Thinking, thumbs down. You got to express yourself. And they take this original romantic idea, mix it with a lot of anarchism, and that's how you get a progressive who believes that just expressing yourself is the answer. That there is no inherent philosophy. Remember the relativism, deconstructionism, right? It's all based in this idea. They don't put the metaphysics back, which would bridge some of these things. That's what I'm trying to do. No. They just say it's open-ended. The mind is, we've discovered its incapacities. And so we're throwing it over philosophically. And we get to our progressivism, which is just raw sensation, raw feeling, raw self-expression. And tomorrow that can lead to say, just kill people and feel good about it. Just stuff your face. Doesn't matter how fat and unhealthy you become. Right? Doesn't, just smash statues and break windows. Just infest all the universities and colleges. Just tell the kids, teach the kids that they can have a tail and could be any kind of dog or cat that they want. They can't come back at you because we already know that the mind is incapable of giving us fundamental access to reality. Yeah. And that has let them off the hook. They're constitutional psychological inferiors who are waiting, loving this. But they don't know that who handed them these teachings. These guys in the Frankfurt School are 50 times smarter than them and knew that they wanted this. The Herbert Marcuses and all knew. Remember we talked about the gluttons? The people who live exclusively for just sensational pleasure? They're in the hands of the puppet masters. And so the puppet master said, if we write books and we distribute them, to the students in America, it's a long work, long march through the institutions. We'll indoctrinate them. We'll make them enemies of knowledge, misosophists, haters of wisdom, and haters of the wise. Turn off your mind. Go to drugs. You'll go down to Costa Rica and swing in the trees. Just do whatever you roll around in the mud at Woodstock. Give up on reason. Give up on morality. That's all. There's no philosophical credibility behind it. You see, no foundations. And so this radical skepticism, this radical deconstruction of the mind occurred. Everything we're talking about, you see, is rampant, is being taught in the schools today. And since culture, think of Western culture, which is always the target, nobody else's culture is ever targeted. So the teachers and these professors, they say, culture was born out of these intellectual pursuits. But when we see that there's no backing to that, and we see these imperfections of mind, then all your cultural motifs are just so much garbage. Go and trash it, kids. Just put up the sludge artwork. Just make these sludge movies. Right? Just listen to the sludge music. Don't let anybody talk you down. So the average student may not intellectually know the things we've talked about. That takes some doing, like I've done in my life, to go back and really work out where these turning points were and how they could have so easily gone right, but they went wrong. Okay? And I'm doing that to try and salvage, not just point out problems, but say, hey, if anybody was ever interested in changing things, here's the way to do it. Because that leaves hope, that leaves optimism but I know it's only something that individual atomized person, and even then they have to be in a desperate state for them to finally hear the truth, because you're surrounded by the liars. But those people those hysterics were, and they're animated by a will to negation. They were happy to receive this from on high. Happy for the mental takedown, the trashing of reason, or any kind of metaphysical reality. They couldn't wait for it. So even a very tawdry version of it, these Marcusos could just butcher it. And that was satisfactory. The
Yeah.
public would eat it up.
And we'll definitely get more into the work of Marcuse in this Frankfurt School, because I think it's so apt to what's going on today. It's maybe even worth its own episode, going into more about the psychological manipulation of the population to follow down this hedonistic path. When I think of these hedonistic types, one of the main things that defines them, and it's rampant today, is that they don't believe there is any morality. They think it's all just sort of made up and there is no basis or origin to it. Can you speak a little bit about what morality really is? And then maybe even getting a little bit about, we spoke about different types of these perverse hedonists. You know, you talk about the obsessives, you talk about the depressives and the schizoid type. Can you speak then a little bit more about, you know, what defines these different ones? What causes a person to go down these different tracks of rejecting freedom, of rejecting truth, of rejecting morality?
Well, oh man, these are great questions. See, I don't know. It could be parenting, could be a big thing. If you're a schizoid type, I would look always to the parents that caused you to be like that, as opposed to one of the other types. If you're depressive, you see, each one has to be gone into. Say the message that a mother, for instance, gives to her male child, you know, or her influence on that male child, say holding him from what we call the phallic level, that will automatically arrest him at the anal and oral. And I believe this is rampant. That's why we get the overweight millennials today and the ones who are sitting in their basement just eating Doritos all day, right? They're arrested. They didn't get to the phallic because the mother interrupted that process. The mother then over-sexualizes a pretty daughter. Total opposite message. She prevents the son from getting to full phallic, masculinity, her child. But when she sees a pretty daughter, it's like, baby, go get it. Suit up, flaunt it. Whoa, you're going. And she might even do that to a kind of not so pretty girl. This is just the way it works. These are types. You create types. You see, I'm just giving you an illustration of how the father and mother can create types. And so later on, when reality principle kicks in, these oral and anal types, or these over-sexualized, coquettish female types, whatever, right? Each one of them can then fall into different categories, depending on how the parents have set up the double bind situation. And then the father's relationship comes on later. Did they protect the child from the mother's magical thinking? Because that's what happens, right? If you are arrested as a child, let's say for both boys and girls, before the phallic stage, then you've been arrested to magical child thinking. In fact, you may even be arrested in an earlier stage. And I've met them, right? They're the ones hopping down the road, half naked with a placard. Yeah. The exhibitionism, the grandiosity. That's why children, little kids, dance around. The ones who are crawling on all fours, the tail, right? So there's nothing mysterious about this at all. An average psychologist could answer this in their sleep. That's just being regressed before what's known as the phallic stage. People can look it up. The Oedipal stages, 3 to 6, 3 to 7, whatever, right? The girl who's been over-sexualized does pass through the phallic all right. So the mother may hinder a boy, but promote the girl. Then both sexes may look to the father saying, save me. The boy may want to get to the phallic stage because it's natural, organic for him to do so. And he may go, Dad, take me to your world. I want to hang around you and your men friends. I like it. Let's play basketball. Let's go to the game. Let's go to the shop and chop things up, or let's fix the car. And the girl may do the same thing, saying, Dad, I realize that it's not good, like mommy has primed me to go and seduce men like you. I see that you suffer. You men suffer from that. I don't like women who do that. I think they're horrible, and I think you think they're horrible too. So make me different. But if the father should fail in any of these duties, And believe you me, these are implicit duties. If they find out that that father is in orbit in orbit around the will of a terrible mother, all these things one could talk about, it's another change in typology. This is a long way around of answering your question. So that by the teenage years, in order to resolve all of these conflicts and many more, there are multiple ways. Well, we're just isolating the 4 coping mechanisms. You think that's all there is? There's full-blown schizophrenia. So the schizoid is a person who just freezes. They're ice cubes on legs. They are the people who realize that the cause of all this misery is a self. So they're saying to themselves, well, if I didn't have this self, I wouldn't suffer. So I'm shutting down selfhood. I know I've got to hold a job down, so I'll just put on this persona. But basically, I'm unempathic. I can't reach out to other people because if I kill off myself, then I'm going to be very, very cold. But see, our world likes people like that. They make good managers. They make good clipboard wielders. They make good cops. They make good officials. So the schizoid finds himself, to his amazement, he was thinking if I enter the world, here's a schizoid, I'm going to really, really suffer. No, our world is itself schizogenic. It promotes your ass. They like you. You're very professional. You dot every I and you cross every T. He's our best worker. Give him the badge, the lapel, and the promotion. So that's why when you walk into offices and buildings and shopping malls, you're meeting schizoids by the million because they're the ones who actually got promoted. And you're wondering, who's this fucking faceless wooden entity who's got no genuine empathy? You're meeting them every fucking where, over the counter, all the time, because society's promoting them. Then you get the obsessive compulsive, who already described him. He looked at this youth and said, I got approval when I was neat and tidy and clean. Well, that lowered my anxiety. So here we go. I'm going to do that to the nth degree. Does society penalize you for that? Hell no. You can get in the military and become a general overnight. You can become an admiral. All of these types find out, to their amazement. Look at in sports. What does he think a coach? Stand up, chest out, shoulders back. The obsessive compulsive does very well at boot camp and everywhere else. Then the depressive. He's no one to think of as being real. He knocked on the door, begging and begging and begging for the approval, but for some strange reason didn't get it, girl or boy. So he goes into a funk and sits there in a kind of a morbid situation, waiting to be accepted by the world. He might think of himself as some radical outsider, malcontent, and some almost mystic. This is where you can get really confused. He's a psychopath, right? But he can look like a sage to himself. He might even decorate that by, reading a few Deepak Chopra books or something, or going to meditation class or whatever. I'm depressed. There's a whole school of that. But don't be fucking fooled. Yes, don't be fooled by that.
Depressive. Just the voice.
And then as soon as that person finds anything, you see, that they do fit into, you'll watch the depression go away. And the hysteric, we've already, so these are all coping mechanisms. But to answer your question about what is real morality, see, you have to go back to the thing we talked about originally about whether man is a beast or not in his inception. Because if he is, then obviously there's no question of having any conversations about morality. Those are just stupid. Like the progressive thinks they're stupid. The Fabians, the Marcusans, the Frankfurt School, they just think that's just chit-chat. We've told you. It's Darwin. And Freud picked up on Darwin, and so did Nietzsche, right? They were all influenced by him. They're all contemporaries. Man is a beast in his origin, end of story. If there's morality, it's just some cultural device that'll last all about 5.5 minutes. You can be scraped off it at any second like it is. And so it's just dog eat dog. It's just the will to power. But then, as I show in my work, something very strange happened. During the time of these phenomenologists, and later the existentialists, here and I'm thinking specifically of Heidegger, we've done many podcasts on this, he came along to show you the origins of the will. Remember we said free will contains the word will. back to our freedom talk today. If you say something like free will, hold on, that's made of two words. Freedom, which we've already discussed, and will. Freedom is the thing that is magical and metaphysical because it's not in nature, and it speaks of God, it speaks of a higher spirit, because nothing fixed can make freedom, but something free could make something fixed. Isn't it? If you're a free being and you want to make a train set up in your attic, and you want those trains to run, in a certain way on those tracks, you can do it because you're free. But a fixed thing could never make freedom. So everybody's got an arse about face. But then the other word, will. So what do we know about will? Well, only what people know from Darwin and Nietzsche and Freud. And that's why you get the nightmare that you get. But along comes the quiet Heidegger, and he put a little cleft into this nightmare, right? And what it did was, see, he lit a atomic bomb under your Nietzsche's and your Schopenhauer's and your Freud's. But he was such a quiet man that he did this like an Aikido master, right? People were like knocked for six, completely comatose, and they didn't even know it. It happened in the dark. It happened so quietly, so deftly. But what it boiled down to was this. And I have to put it into my own words, remember, because he said it in such an extremely convoluted and sort of a
dense way. Yeah.
Yes, a dense way, and also not trying to attack anybody. The impact of what he was saying was this. Two words that the existentialists use is thrownness and facticity. They're kind of connected. Thrownness, you and I have talked about, it's just you waking up one day and finding yourself in a world. You don't know how you got here. You don't know why you have these fucking parents, and you don't know why you Irish as opposed to Canadian or Swiss or Australian, right? And you find out you've got this thing called a history. And you're also, even more important than your history, comes that you're a temporal being, you're aging. There's a thing called time. Now, you're not thinking all of this. Of course, this is all becomes non-consciously aware of. Facticity follows on from that you're white as opposed to black, that you're tall as opposed to short, right? That you're intelligent as opposed to stupid, that in your culture, people drive on their left or their right, right? That you've got rules and regulations, that buildings are made in a certain way, that the money is called, punts or pounds or ducats or whatever, right? So everything, all this preordained world around you is the facticity that you can really do nothing about. There's already schools. There's already decision about when you're going to go to nursery school. There's already, decisions that the parents have made about everything in your life. You've made no contribution. Everything is already done for you. The sea of facticity. So Heidegger says that both these things, but particularly the facticity, start working to thwart your personal desires. Of course they do, right? That's why babies scream and throw tantrums. You've come into a world in which you have absolutely no fucking rights. Everything is preordained. Everything. The job that your dad's doing, the personality of your parents and their grandfathers and uncles and aunts, all of this is preordained. You can do nothing about it. Whether you like them or you don't like it is irrelevant. So on a fundamental level, all of this stuff is what is known as the collective will. The facticity is the will of others. It's a world put together by the will of others. And your teensy-weensy little will now has to push back at it when your desires are thwarted. Because either you capitulate and give in and become completely docile and passive, or you find that you muster your own will to push hard, to push up against some of these impositions when and if you can. What do you think school life is all about? And we all know about the kids who just sit there and let it all happen and be pushed around. And we know that there's ones who fucking don't like that. See? And we're all like this. So what Heidegger is trying to say here is that all these people we spoke about have got it wrong. It is will that creates will. But he put this little cleft, this little fissure between man as beast and man as social animal. This is done so subtly that most people missed it. He's not necessarily saying that man is born a beast with a will to power. He's giving a later birth date. You have to be already born. You already have to encounter a world that was not made by you but by others. And their will initiates your will. So the date of birth of the will is not, as Freud and Darwin and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and all the rest of the world thought. What this means is that man is not necessarily, says Heidegger, born a beast. Now, he doesn't tell you what you are. He doesn't want to jump. He just puts a question mark in that cleft and says, if man is not a beast in his origin, he might be something else. And don't you see what this does? It opens the way for a Carl Jung. It opens the way now for an Otto Rank and existential psychology and even a bit of mysticism. And, it opens the door a lot. It could even open the door to Christianity. Not that he was a Christian, but a Christian is going to think, see, we've been telling you man is not a beast. Well, Heidegger's saying, yeah, well, maybe you should come to the table and talk about it. My philosophy allows you at least to come to the table. I might not like what you got to say, but I am at least allowing you to come to the table. Something radical took place here, because in this separation, in this extraordinary postponing of the date of the will. Now, the other one that you would always mention in a conversation of this type is the great Viktor Frankl, because he is listening to this. He was a friend of Heidegger. They met. And he's the guy who replaced Nietzsche's will to power with the will to meaning. All now making sense, right? He is not jumping to Christianity or necessarily a metaphysics. He's just saying, I'll tell you what man is. I will present the new picture. It's not man as the beast, the modernized, civilized gorilla. It's not man as will to power. It's man as will to meaning. This is his origin. And you know something? Heidegger didn't fight that. I think he, in fact, agreed with it in his own quiet way. He done his job to overthrow this Faustian, perspective that had animated the whole of modern science and modern philosophy, especially in Britain. This Hobbesian and all the other non-German, aspects. So this is a long way around to answering your question. If my will and the will to power is caused by the will to power of the masses, then the will to power rubbing on my will is an immoral act. So my reacting to it can be equally immoral. But from my point of view, it could be moral. I'm thinking I'm doing a right thing by saying, fuck you, you're not going to push on me. How dare you? You pushed on me first, I'm going to push back. So the question of morality takes a back seat, because I feel I've been violated. And you know something? You have on a phenomenological basic level. You have, and you don't like it. You've been bullied by a world, So I always describe it in my work as iron rubbing on iron or bone on bone. It's not a good solution. Something's going to bust. There's no oil there. And that's what we've been doing. So the whole thing is immoral, but there's no solution to it. The solution would be to say, world, stop. None of you people can impose your will on me. Is that likely to happen? You'd be locked up. You can scream blue murder. In fact, it's just getting worse. Because how is it getting worse? If every new child coming into the world, will to power, is animated by the collective will to power, then will creates will. And their will eventually joins the mass will. And it's like this, fifth planet. The more you shoot at it, the bigger and more powerful it gets. So my will joins the collective will for the next incarnation of the problem. It doesn't weaken it. My efforts and will add to the evil will. To that degree, Schopenhauer was right. This complexion of the will isn't very positive, you see, but at least it'll break my will. Or if I'm lucky enough, I might not break it, but I'll certainly die in my life as a broken person, feeling that, others trampled on me all my, and that can happen very, very early. Where's the morality in all of this? So this is one perspective on morality, right? It has to come from a deeper place. And this is what Viktor Frankl then was talking about in his term of, will to meaning. And you have to read his work to understand it. And believe you me, it'll bring tears to your fucking eyes, right? When you read what he had to go through in the concentration camps. And now he formulated his amazing theories about what man might be in his origin, since all the thing I want to focus on is that if the birth of the will is, like I say, placed later and isn't man's core identity, then a whole world opens up now as to what that identity is. You see? And now we have to reframe from this everything we know about man's constitution, man's morality, his virtue, and we have to be open to metaphysical dimensions, like we've just talked about with the idealists and their concepts of freedom. But if you don't have this conversation, then don't you see why I'm jaded? Why I don't want to be participant in any debates about this? You'll have some Christian on one side, some atheist on the other. Do you know how bankrupt I think that is? Or some feminist?
There's no point, is there?
Yeah, that's why it's gone round and round forever. Or some new ager, some Deepak Chopra trying to, coach people about. They don't know shit about the Western tradition. They only know some Eastern tawdry garbage about selflessness and altruism.
And denial of the self.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They may not believe that man is bestial in his origin, okay, but what are they putting there in its place? You see? I'm not particularly convinced by that thesis. May have some elements of truth, but I think we need something far more robust than they've been able to offer. Yeah. And that's why I like to go towards the subjects that I do. But again, at the end of the day, I'm no one to tell anybody else. If you believe what I say, and then you realize that there is this question mark, it's up to each individual then to come to their own conclusion through study. What is man in his origins? Is he the spiritual being, right? Well, if you say that he is, then doesn't he need to work on that? Doesn't he have to prove it? In his morality, in his virtues? Won't that change his entire life? Maybe that person then can't stand to be around a lot of other people who are not virtuous. And may he not also then become jaded and a discontent? Somebody who can't interact with society? You see, there's all these negatives as well. Because remember, all around you are people of the lie at that point. So when you open these doors, it can become very, very, very dark very quick. Is that what it means to be authentic? Is it you have to then, not work in society? Or some other path? It becomes a very personalistic thing. So I had to write a book on personalism to unpack that. See, one thing leads to another. But I think it's just a very important thing for world philosophy, as well as for the individual, to realize that Nietzsche got it wrong. And those who picked up on his teachings, like Freud and others, to this degree, they got this wrong. Because if man is not bestial in his origins, that his will is certainly there, the will to power is certainly there, but it comes on later from the impact of the world, of a necrophilous world. Yeah. This then changes the complexion completely. Because what happens then, like I argue in some of my programs, if man's origin is divine, right? If he's anthropos, if he's connected to the moral universe, well, what it means is, how come we haven't been taught that? Is there a school anywhere in the whole world that teaches you that? That teaches you about the phi ratio and Fibonacci series and sacred geometry and man as anthropos? This is what the Hermetics of Italy wanted. This is what the German mystics wanted. This is what Isaac Luria wanted. This is what Hegel wanted. Why are we not being taught that? So this is why I have a personal, mission to, in my own small way, bring some of these teachings back. I'm glad we got a chance on this program to even talk about it, because do you know how difficult it is to usually even get around to these points?
Yeah. I understand. I know. We're very grateful for it. Very lucky to have this. We've touched on so many different topics here today. One of the main ones being about morality and about freedom. You spoke a little bit about the different types of ways that people repress themselves. And it made me think of Alexander Lowen. One of the things I think people should really check out is one of his books in regards to like how this shows up in the physicality of people. He was able to almost determine what way people were repressing themselves through their shape of their body in a weird sense. I'll try to bring up a few images next time when we're chatting about this because it's so interesting because you can start to study the physiognomy of people in a way and get a better sense of how they're doing that also. One of the other things we haven't really spoke about is a new type of ethic that Erich Neumann, Carl Jung's top disciple, spoke about. He wrote a book called A New Ethic, and it's about shadow work. And it's about understanding evil in a different way, because what was determined as evil in your early life led to the repression of different parts of yourself, of your authentic self. And his way of then being able to reintegrate those was to change your perspective and no longer see them as evil and understanding the duality of both of these things. So we'll maybe even talk about that a little bit next time because I thought it was so interesting. Maybe as a final question, a lot of this all seems to stem from what happens in childhood as a person comes into the world. And probably one of the most taboo subjects that there is today is the role of the mother and the evil that the mother can do. Specifically, I'm really thinking about how they nurture the will. And again, they can take it in two different directions. One is to encourage this will to meaning through authenticity, and the other is this will to power that comes from their sort of tyrannical repression of them. It goes into your work about adultism and about Dragon Mother as well. Maybe to set us up for another discussion, can you speak a little bit about how the mother crushes the will of the child to lead them into this direction of maybe the basis of evil as we've been discussing so far?
Well, that's right. We just a little bit touched on that earlier today. When she sexualizes a pretty girl, a pretty daughter, she is violating that girl's will. When she holds the male son back from his phallic period, she's misusing his will. Because the will in a natural way, the organic will, wants to develop along healthy lines. Remember we said man is not bestial in his origin? Then if he's not bestial in his origin, you can trust nature and you can trust telos to lead you right. But the interfering parties are the parents. They are the creatures of the will to power. The terrible mother is wielding her will over that of her children. To arrest them at any level is to violate their will and their identity. To send them out into the solar world as necrophiles, either use that world as a bunch of treats or to go into it like they are today as betas and haters. All this is to violate their natural will and to set them up in her own image. These are all children of Medusa to go out to do her will. That's all you're seeing. It's regressed types or over-sexualized types who are in deep state of inner turmoil. They never encounter any wise grandfathers or grandmothers. They never encounter any enlightened witnesses. And if and when they do, they don't listen to them. Because I know cases where somebody like this, a girl or a boy, have encountered somebody who wants to change their ways and may, influence them. It never worked. It's a giggle. Very, very soon they will ignore everything that they've been told and then move on back to the world and carry on their evil ways. Yeah. Because remember, they were programmed early with the parents. There's very little you can do later on. And I really mean that. There's very little you can do. So they're stuck. They're going to be in serious trouble. You can't change it after a certain amount of years go by. Yeah, by the time they've reached the teenage years, there's just something, I think they've had too many years solidifying in their ways for any concrete changes to be made. You won't even really see superficial changes. Be lucky to see a few even superficial changes. But even those can be washed away by the next group of people they get involved with. You'll soon see that your influence is just wiped out. It's just a giggle. Now, remember, we said that the mother's role, you see, she stands at the lineman between the natural and the human. We talked about that in the beginning. The unfree world of fixed laws of necessity and the human world that's free and open. Who do you think stands, her shadow is cast over that lineman? Who do you have to pass through as a portal to get from one to the other? The mother. So in this case, this is what divides a dragon mother from a terrible mother. The dragon mother is going to facilitate the change from the pleasure principle to the reality principle, or as I like to say, from the archaic, natural world into the human. The terrible mother wants to hold you back to the chthonic, Tellurian world of the animal. She's threatened by your individuality. She knows where that road leads to the solar world, and she's threatened by it. So in some way, she wants to either hold you back or send you into the solar world as her agent. But that's it. Those are the two options. Either you don't get there at all, that's her first choice. But if you do get there, you'll be her agent to bring ruin to other people who are there. Yeah. That's why it's necrophilus. And then that mother is the dark mother, who's basically the agent of nature, nature's fixed laws. But see, don't forget that although those laws are fixed and unfree, there is something psychologically comforting about that womb-like world of predictability, of nature taking over, of mother providing everything that is needed, of you not having a sense of self or individuality. Remember we said the schizoid and all these other guys? That's the problem. They've isolated the problem of suffering as the self. So they tend to be very regressive in their heart of hearts. They're looking for that surrogate womb. You can't go back to the physical womb. We've already talked about that. So they then look for the surrogate womb, but there's surrogate wombs in plenty. The mind does nothing but create womb metaphors. That's, according to Otto Rank, that's its prime directive. And that's all feminized. The heroic person doesn't do that. He wants to meet reality on its own terms, you see, and face the challenges. But that's not everybody. Not by a long chalk. So yes, this is about... Now, what happens is that the question is then, what happens is we don't have morality in that constellation. We have the mother's will being the moral reality. She dictates. She doesn't help translate what is moral in the highest sense. No, her will replaces that. You'll do what I fucking say. Freud said that motherhood and tyranny are identical. It's a direct quote.
Some quote that.
It is a direct quote. That's right. And only a simple observation tells you. And this being the Frankfurt School have made it so that that then is weaponized. And the mother is then traumatized. And as one of our latest guests, Alfred, he said that, look, when the single mother is allowed to exist without the father, she's in an inner state of anxiety over how to raise her kids. Will the money really be there? See, historical women had the father and the grandfathers and the men around. When the welfare state comes in, yes, okay, you've got that, but actually, psychologically, the woman is thrown into greater stress and anxiety, all of which communicates itself to her offspring right from the womb level. That's what they want. Yeah, that's what they want. The single mother is the doomsday weapon. So her will becomes the new morality. There's no parental imagos around at all. There's no male imagos at all. The schools are filled with women teachers, women administrators, women headmasters. The male child is not even allowed to show any sign of adrenaline or moving around or play acting. We're in an entirely feminized society, and almost no one is standing up. They're too timid to even fight it, because this thing has been happening generationally. So if you stood up and fought it, you'd be called a patriarch, a woman, a mansplainer. Yeah, it's got nothing but manginas all over the fucking planet now. These betas, who are those poisonous ones who entered the solar world but are really doing the will of the terrible mother. But I'm one of the only people going into all of this.
The only one. You don't come across this
The
anywhere
only
else in
one,
all
yeah.
these. Even in the whole conspiracy movement or alternative research,
Oh,
virtually nobody gets into the psychology and the consciousness and the study of
nope.
philosophy. And lots of people can look around and tell you, oh, yeah, sure, there's all this like psyop against the West or this inversion of the truth and what's going on, of what we call moral and what's not. But nobody gets into the root source of it other than yourself, which is why I'm so grateful for you coming on again.
Oh, no, no. Perfect.
Maybe one of the things people can look up, I was thinking about Alice Miller's book. She wrote, I think it was The Problem of the Gifted Child or of the Golden Child. And so that's one of the ways in which, say, the mother or whatnot crushes the will of the young child in order to, they build up a stronger persona, which then they latch onto. And that leads to this, sort of trauma that sits behind that mask and that they have to deal with later in life. Yeah, well, maybe wrap up from there, Michael, with it, and we'll touch on this next time. We didn't really get into how the architects of control use this information in order to enslave us also, but I think that's something we'll come on to with it. Have you any final
Well,
thoughts for us just to wrap up on now, Michael, or?
well, see, they know you haven't read your Heideggers. And
Yeah,
Darwin and
yeah.
Schopenhauer and Nietzsche are huge, as
Mm,
is Freud.
mm,
They know that the teachers who get the PhDs, they're familiar with those guys' theories, and they haven't questioned them. Yeah, it's all by design. There are many people who can take down those guys. Even Otto Rank, Freud's own, secretary, was able to refute some of these points brilliantly, let alone Alfred Adler and others who came later, Karen Horney, Melanie Klein. There's been nothing but wonderful works. But they know you ain't going to look. I just mentioned Viktor Frankl. Whoa! Right? And Heidegger and Gabriel Marcel and Paul Tillich and so many others. But they don't teach those in school. They park those guys. They're forgotten thinkers. Then they can't get Hegel right. Then they can't get Schelling right. It's a big campaign. People can go to my website, germanophobia.net. Maybe we can, because you need that part too. There's been a historical campaign against Germany. See, that has to factor in as well. Otherwise, you don't get any of this. And that's been going on since about the 1850s, if not even from before. And that has its own reasons. And this accounts for a lot of what, because, the West, England and France saw what was coming out of Germany. This has a very, very practical reason for being a conspiracy against Germany, because they sat back and watched what was taking place with these Schillers and Goethes and von Herders and Hamann, Joseph Hamann, and the whole mystical tradition going back through Isaac Luria, all the way back, to Jakob Boehme and all these wonderful, wonderful men. Absolutely extraordinary men. And they shook in their pants of what this would mean for the world. Oh, yeah. We've only been sketching it out, giving you an overview of their theories. If people read the article, Freedom of Man, right, that we talked about earlier, that'll help. There's other things on my Schelling's own site that'll give a primer. You see, a mysticism, my article on mysticism. Oh, definitely my contrarium article. And we've got dozens of podcasts on all of these subjects. This is what we mostly do on Unslaved, by and large. You see, at some point, right? And we're doing it now again. So I'm trying to bring this tradition back in a healthy way with citations and so on. We talked about Owen Barfield. He was a great follower of these German romantics. We talk about the transcendentalists in America. They got wiped out by the analytical school. Most Americans haven't even heard of those guys, right? And yet these are some of the greatest minds that America's ever produced. So we're talking about, intellects of the first rank. These are people that you can't leave out of the narrative, and yet they have been left out of the narrative. And what's happened then is that their teachings have become mutilated. Like we said, the anarchists, the later romantics, the left Hegelians, right, and the progressives, they have chopped up all these great things we've talked about and just taken little bits of it and remixed it. It's like a remix in music. And it's cacophony. But the Frankfurt School was absolutely overwhelmingly elated to hear about this thing about the mind not being able to answer certain fundamental things, starting with Hume, right? And the problem of causality. People can look that right up. David Hume, problem of causality. Then comes Kant throwing doubt on whether you can tell between an appearance and reality. You see? Then this one that we've talked about. where the mind cannot answer whether you're a blank slate or you have innate ideas. It's, at the end of the day, it's just going to be opinion. Then we had this issue about the men of great intellect insisting that man is the beast. And how would you know? That would leave you just unable to tell. This thing about freedom, is it a human convention? Is it something that, bestowed to you by your culture? Or is it coming from a deeper wellspring? Is it really the emanation, the very thought of God? But if it is, then that means that we have to think of evil as being permitted by the highest God, whose relation to his creature is so one of love, that he will allow him to be the most immoral being, feral. But you'll learn by your error. But I, as a spirit, can only extend to you the complete freedom that I myself have. As God, I am a free being. I can only extend to you of my own nature, and that is freedom. If you abuse it, that's your business. You see, all of these questions. But as I say, the Frankfurt School were able to introduce these memes in a different way, through their playwrights, through their intellectuals, through their talking heads, of the limitations of the mind. And this allowed then these neo-romantics to say, see, it's not about thinking or morality or reason, it's about self-expression. And it is, to a degree. That's meant to be part of it too. But what they really meant was it's a necrophilous, regressive, deconstructive and destructive, you see, necrophilous urge that's being unleashed now. But it has to be disguised. So let's disguise it as the proletariat fighting for their rights against the oppressor. It's got to be woman fighting the patriarchy. Yeah, that'll work. Nobody will believe that, right? Yeah. What the fuck? So the whole thing started up. Blacks with whites, Catholics with Protestants, right? Unbelievable. Rich of poor, whatever you want, whatever way you're looking at, Russians versus Westerners. You see, they were able to mobilize this now. And it's just raw will to power with no morality anywhere in sight. In fact, they're not trying to tell you that the morality is the social convention. It's this relative thing. Yeah. When they found out that you can make this problems of the mind, of consciousness, absolute, then they know, okay, now we have the case for relativism. If the ignorance of the mind into its own nature is an absolute, and no amount of decades or centuries going by will the mind ever answer these questions. In fact, nothing's happened except we've deconstructed certainty, right? Gödel coming along and others breaking it down in terms of mathematics, other people doing it in form of language, other people doing it in every other way. Look at the quantum scientists. We can't be sure if a thing is a fucking particle or a wave.
Yeah.
Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, right?
Yeah.
So this went down a treat. Nobody's looked at the higher reasons for this, and the Germanic thought that was trying to contradict it and put your mind back into metaphysical truths and numinous realities like the origin of the I and the origin of nature, things we've talked about, and the contrarium and God's essential spirit. They left all of that out, so they could just present this very deconstructive model and make it into, as you said earlier, power dynamics. See, and have dynamics. But we've got to remember there is another reality, and it's about then each person sincerely, conscientiously trying to follow up that, my work is a place to start if they're interested in that.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, we'll leave links down below to everything as well that you've been speaking about, and I think it'll probably give enough for people to chew on for another week or so. One last thing maybe people could look up, I'm just thinking of, is the logos therapy. That's the therapy about this will to meaning that we spoke about as well also. Yeah, we'll maybe leave this new ethic of Erich Newman and I spoke about next time, because maybe that's a little book we'll go over or something. But yeah, just once again, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to everyone else that's been tuning in to watch these so far. I've been appreciating it, and if anyone's any feedback, please leave a little comment down below, and we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.